Hello, fabulous sixth graders. This is Miss Folker, and I'm going to be reading for you chapters 20 to 22 of Detention Club. And I have a digital version of the book on my iPad, so that's why my face is going to be glowing the whole time. But without further ado, here we go. Chapter 20. It felt weird to walk by myself to school the following Monday. Even though I was mad at Drew for accusing me of being the source of all our troubles, I had to admit that I already couldn't wait for the experiment to be over so Drew and I could go back to being best friends. What the heck was he thinking? He'd never been good at coming up with ideas on his own. He was just going to make a fool of himself like that new kid last year, Pierre something, who moved to Fenwick midway through 5th grade. He tried to get everyone to like him the first day by bringing in a box of fancy French cookies. And it worked for a little while, but by the end of recess he'd run out of cookies and everyone went back to not being friends with him. He's not in middle school now, and nobody knows what happened to him. At the same time, I realized that I didn't have a solution myself. I pictured the way classmates seemed shocked that I was with the Sweet Brothers at the mall. None of them had tried to talk to Hugh and Hank, though. I thought about what Sunny had said about them. Maybe she was right. In which case, being friends with the Sweet Brothers would solve the bullying problem, but me and Drew would still be losers. How could I use my new friendship with the Sweet Brothers to become popular? I suddenly felt really depressed that there was no obvious answer, but it turned out the answer was right around the corner. I walked in the lobby before homeroom, and Trent immediately approached me. "I saw you last week at the mall," he said. "Oh yeah?" I scratched the top of my head. "I don't recall that at all." "Were you with the Sweet Brothers?" "They're friends of mine," I said. "Can you get me in tight with them?" I suppose I could try. At first I wanted to immediately bring him over to the Sweet Brothers and introduce them, but then I thought that would be the end of that, just like when poor old Pierre ran out of his fancy French cookies. It's not that easy. I can't just introduce you right now. They might beat you up or something. Trent looked scared. "Don't worry," I added. "I'll figure something out. You have to earn their respect like I did." "How do I do that?" "I think I have a plan," I said. "Are you free this afternoon?" Trent nodded. The bell rang and we trudged upstairs. I almost ran right into Sunny. She was lugging her yellow inventor's duffel bag around, even though she had her backpack on too. "Why are you carrying that thing around? That's what the cubbies are for." "I was working on my prototype last night, genius," she said. "Besides, I'm not leaving my bag overnight here. There's a thief, remember? The thief's not going to try to steal something from you again. It's like lightning. If you get struck once, then you probably won't get struck again." "There's a forest ranger who got struck 7 times, actually. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records," she objected. I rolled my eyes. "Whatever, have fun lugging that thing around for the rest of your life." When I showed up at social studies after lunch, Trent was sitting in his usual spot, staring intently at his desktop. I waited for Mrs. Farley to get into her lecture about whatever it was we were supposed to be learning before I commenced with what I later thought of as conversation method. The teacher turned around to scribble something on the chalkboard, at which point I said loudly, "What's that, Trent?" He looked up at me with a confused expression on his face. And so these people from this country attacked the people from this other country, and Miss Farley rambled on, writing some weird names I'd never heard of on the chalkboard. Trent stared back down at his laptop. "I'm sorry, come again, Trent?" I said. Miss Farley turned around. "No talking, boys," she said. I shrugged my shoulders at the teacher and squinted at the chalkboard, scribbling lines into my notebook in a way that suggested from a distance that I was writing actual words. She went back to talking about some war or meeting overseas that took place a really long time ago, and I said a third time, "What did you just ask me, Trent?" "I didn't say anything," he said. I said, "Let's stop the chit-chat, Trent," Miss Farley said. "It's not me, Teach." Trent's face was turning bright red. She sighed disappointingly at him, then resumed writing something on the chalkboard. I turned to Trent. "What is it you're asking me?" I whispered loudly. "It's not me. I'm not saying anything," Trent shouted. "What the heck's wrong with you?" "That's it, you two," Miss Farley snapped. "You continue your conversation in detention after school." "Will do," I thought. "Mrs. Farley, Street Magic's assistant here, keeps talking to me, but I swear I'm not saying anything." "And how do you respond to that, Street Magic... Mr. Lee? She asked me. Agree to disagree, I said, trying to look confused. I was merely asking Trent to repeat what he was asking me. She sighed, then turned and continued writing things on the chalkboard. What's wrong with you? Trent whispered to me. Shh, I whispered back. You're going to get us in more trouble. Trent's face turned red. When the bell rang at the end of the day, I practically spurted off to detention class. As I turned the corner, I almost crashed into Sunny, who was sitting at a desk in the middle of the hallway wearing her stupid hall monitor sash. Are you trying to glom on me? She said. No. Well, you can't run in the halls, she said. I'm going to have to write you up. But it's after school, I shouted. Why do they need a hall monitor after school anyway? I volunteered, she replied. We have band rehearsal soon, so I figured I'd squeeze in some minutes. That's incredibly nerdy, you know that? Why are you running in the first place? I have detention, I said with a big smile on my face. And you're happy about that, right? So I'm the nerd. I'm so proud of you. It takes courage to be able to admit something so lame about yourself, I said, taking off. You know that's not what I meant. Slow down, she shouted after me, but I ignored her. I opened the door to room 12, and Trent was already there, staring at his desk in the back row. He stared at desks a lot for some reason. He looked up and waved me over. Already the power of detention force field was working. Aloha, Trent, I said. So what was that thing you were asking of me in class earlier? Dude, I wasn't saying a word. You were talking to me. I'm kidding. I did it on purpose. Why would you do that? He asked, fuming. Well, you said you wanted to get in tight with the Sweet Brothers, didn't you? What does that have to do with anything? He asked, but when the doors opened, in walked Hugh and Hank. Hey guys, I said cheerfully. Do you know Trent? They glared at him. Did you come here to bring us our allowance? Hugh asked him. Trent looked at me. I shook my head, so Trent shook his head at them. What are you in here for? Hank asked. Trent looked at me again. Let's just say teachers are crazy about him at this point, and leave it at that, I said. Hugh laughed and sat down next to Trent, who noticeably stiffened, but by the end of detention it seemed they were getting along famously, and Trent leaned over and whispered to me, Thanks, bro. So you think they like me? Honestly, I don't think so, I said. How can you tell? We were talking the entire detention. I know those two. They're not sure about you. Just keep getting detentions and I'll work on them from my end. Trent sighed and I patted him on the shoulder. It's a good start. I know they'll change their mind about you eventually, but for this to work, you can't tell anyone how I'm helping you. If the Sweet Brothers were to find out, we'd be toast, and I can't have that. I owe you one, man, he replied. The detention theory worked. Maybe Drew was right, in a way. We had to break up in order for me to figure out how to finally solve things. Chapter 21. I got home from school and Mom was sitting in the living room with her sewing kit out. She waved me over. Look, I'm making you something. A pile of my clothes was lying in a heap next to her. I frowned. You're not trying to make me clothes again, are you? I asked her. When I was in 4th grade, I went through a mini growth spurt, and my mom was so upset that the clothes cost so much, so she tried making me clothes that winter. Went to school in sweaters that looked okay in the morning, but if they got caught in a nail or on the edge of a desk, they would unravel, and I'd come home with half a sleeve missing and a ball of yarn trailing behind me like a colored tail. She would have kept making me shoddy clothes for the rest of my life, but then I stopped growing, and haven't grown since, so I guess there's one good thing about being so little. I'm sewing your initials into every piece of clothing you own, she said. I got an email from the vice principal. He said they were emailing all parents to alert them to this thief problem at your school. Why are you sewing my initials into my underwear? I asked her, and she stared back at me. How could I ever possibly have my underwear stolen at school? She frowned. I suppose that would be a little difficult, she admitted, but be better safe than sorry. Think about those poor students who have iPods and cell phones stolen. Imagine losing a cell phone. Those are expensive. First, I'd have to imagine actually owning a cell phone, I said. You know what I mean. I sighed. I feel sorry for whoever it is that's stealing these things, she said. Are you crazy? I asked her. You feel sorry for someone who steals everyone's stuff? The thief is clearly a very sad young person crying out for help, she said. Imagine what is driving someone to steal like that. I hear it more like someone crying out for a beating, I said. She shook her head sadly at me and went back to sewing. I picked up a pile of my t-shirts and started walking away. What's going on? Sonny asked, entering the living room. I'm stitching Peter's initials into his underwear, Mom explained. Sonny got a big grin on her face. That's a good idea, she said, patting me on the back. It stung. Then when he gets confused, he can just look at his underwear and remember his own name. That's really funny, I said, staring at her. Don't you have to study for your SATs? They're only 3 years away. He's right, Sonny. If you have spare time right now, you could do a practice test. Hey, Peter, look, she said, holding up a pair of my underwear. I spelled a little smiley face next to your initials. Isn't that adorable? Great, I said, rolling my eyes. I'm sure everyone in gym class will love it. For once, I actually knew that I had an English test the next day, so I took the digital camera in my dad's office that night and uploaded all the pics I'd taken in my class the last few weeks. I made separate folders for each class, then opened up a slideshow of the English chalkboard photos. Uh-oh, they were low resolution, and when I zoomed in, the writing on the chalkboard got all grainy. I tried to copy what I could to make out into my notebook, which felt annoying. I was ending up having to take notes anyways. For the rest of study time, I worked on my plan to start using detention theory at school, brainstorming ways to get popular kids into detention. I'd already developed the conversation method, but the problem with it was that it gave me detention too, and as useful as detention was these days, I didn't want it to last forever. I thought about it for a while and eventually came up with what I called the passing notes method. The goal was to make it look like my targets were passing notes in class, which is something the teachers at Fenwick Middle School hate more than anything, it seems. That night I sat at my desk during study time, figuring out who I should frame next. I made a chart of who I figured were the most important popular people in 6th grade, listing the reasons why being friends with them could help me. Here's an example of what the finished chart looked like. Target, Donnie Christopher. Reason, friends with Carson and the Brainiac crew, has a gigantic head. I already have tag class with Carson, but since I'm not popular, he can't see how smart I am. The key is to get Donnie on my side too, and then Carson and the other genius robots will like me. Target, Sally Leathers. Reason, friends with Angie, who has parties all the time that popular people go to. Get in tight with Sally, and Angie will have to invite me. Those were my main targets besides Trent, who I had already worked my magic with. I also planned on framing Heidi Markowitz because she was friends with the field hockey girls, and Sean Jacobs, who hung out with all the skateboarders, and Dylan Armstrong, a Hemingway kid who actually wasn't all that popular, but I heard that he owned a snake and ate live mice, and I'd always wanted to see that in person. The next morning, I raced around the hall before first period looking for the Sweet Brothers. How things had changed. Now I was actually trying to find them instead of avoiding them at all costs. I saw Hank shoving Donnie into his locker, and I ran right up to them. Hey, Hank, I said, and we high-fived. See you this afternoon. Sure enough, Donnie approached me just before English class. Hey, Peter, you're friends with the Sweet Brothers? Sure, we go way back. Can you get them off my back? I'll see what I can do. I sat in class trying to come up with a simple thank note. I worried that I never bothered to check out Donnie's handwriting style, so I ended up writing in robot font. This adult human bores me. I am wasting my internal lithium batteries listening to this unintelligent human instructor tell me things I already know. I will keep my eyes open, but otherwise put myself in sleep mode. Donnie. I carefully filled it into a self-contained square, the way I'd seen girls do it when they expertly passed notes all class long. The plan was to drop off the note somewhere in plain sight so Mr. Wenzel would find it once class was over. When the bell rang, I stayed in my seat while everyone else got up. All the students filed towards the exit. I made a drop-off as subtly as possible, but it wasn't even necessary. Mr. Wenzel had his back to me, erasing stuff he'd written on the chalkboard. Was it really this easy, I wondered? The Sweet Brothers and Trent were waving me over from the back of the detention room when I arrived at the end of the day, but I told them I had to figure out some homework first and sat down by myself at the front. The sound of buses pulling out of the lot filled me with sadness. My plan hadn't worked. But then a moment later the door opened, and in walked a terrified Donnie, who immediately gaped at the sight of the massive Sweet Brothers in the back, and nodded at the empty seat next to me, which he took gratefully. What's the human Pez dispenser doing here? Hank snarled at Donnie. I patted the human Pez dispenser on the back. Let's just say this guy and Mr. Wenzel are no longer on speaking terms, I said, and Hank seemed impressed. Donnie looked confused. I leaned over and whispered, the key to getting them off your back is to get to know them better. Thanks, he whispered, and I hid the smile forming on the inside of my mouth. By framing students into detention, I quickly became an expert on what would get you in trouble and exactly how much trouble it would get you in. I even made a little guide on a piece of paper that I kept hidden in my desk drawer at home, which looked like this. The conversation method, 1 detention. The passing notes method, 3 detentions. The having candy in class method, 3 detentions. The tic-tac-toe method, 1 detention. The writing on the desk method, 2 detentions. I preferred leaving fake notes because it was easy and I could prepare the fake note the night before. The candy method was equally effective, but I didn't use it much because I hate wasting perfectly good candy, obviously. The tic-tac-toe method was easier to prepare than coming up with a fake note. I just draw a bunch of games of tic-tac-toe on a piece of paper, and at the bottom write something like, Sean rules! But it was worth only 1 detention. That it was even worth detention says something about how much teachers hate tic-tac-toe. They hate that kids don't pay attention, but they hate it even more if you don't pay attention because you're playing a game that's so stupid it always ends in a tie. Writing on the desk was risky. Basically, I'd just write someone's initials followed by a really positive word and exclamation point, like HM rules, on my desk. When the teacher saw it, they'd assume Heidi Markowitz had sat there. She would get 2 detentions just like that. But it was risky. It depended on the teacher not paying close enough attention to realize I'd sat there. What I'd eventually figure out is that I could combine the methods to get the students in even more trouble. For example, if I wanted to get Heidi Markowitz in detention for a week, all I would have to do was use the passing notes method, but have the note read, Carrie, I'm loving eating candy right now. Do you want to play tic-tac-toe? Heidi. And like that, boom, Heidi had 7 detentions. I realized that I didn't even have to use my friendship with the sweets to get closer to popular people. Just being in detention with them made us suddenly chummy with each other. It was like there was an invisible force field surrounding room 12 that made everyone inside get along, no matter what. I used the passing notes method to frame Sally into detention, and when she showed up, I just sat next to her and we chatted as if we were back in elementary school together. By the end of detention, I even impressed Sally when she discovered how talented I was at drawing her favorite animal in the entire world, the unicorn. I made sure to draw Sally a unicorn every detention. I figured the key to getting invited to Angie's parties was my expertise at drawing unicorns, and I tried to work in subtle hints as she sat there watching me produce art. You're so good at drawing them, she said one time. Don't forget the tail this time. Of course, I said, scribbling in a silky tail. You know, Sally, in addition to drawing, I'm also really good at interior decorating, for like award ceremonies and more casual social gatherings. What are you talking about? She asked. Okay, so some of my hints weren't working, but the fact that we were friendly made me think it was just a matter of time before I got invited to a party. No matter what type of students they were, nerds, jocks, bullies, or princesses, they were all instantly friendly with me in detention. Trent started saying hi to me every morning in the lobby before homeroom. Heidi waved as I passed her locker between periods, and even Donnie and his brainiac Hemingway pals nodded at me in the hallway. My plan was working. Meanwhile, from what I could gather watching him in the hallways and during lunch, Drew's only plan for becoming popular was going up to the popular kids between classes with a hand covering an eye and asking them if they had come across his left contact lens. I guess there was one perk to being a nobody. No one seemed to know that he had perfect vision. I snuck up on him after 3rd period one morning. You do realize that it's pretty ridiculous to ask someone if they happen to see a contact lens on the floor, I pointed out to him. How would anyone ever stumble across a tiny piece of see-through plastic on the ground? Well, that's what makes my strategy so sound, Drew said after a couple of seconds. I don't actually want them to find a contact lens. Now, do I? He had a point there. Are you just going to ask kids to help you find your contact lens for the rest of your life? I asked him. At some point, they're going to add up how much time we've spent looking for my contacts over the years and realize we've kind of become close friends, he replied. That has to be the lamest idea I've ever heard in my life. You sit by yourself at lunch, so I don't think you're in a position to mock me, he replied. You sit by yourself too, I said. But then at lunch I sat down at our old table and watched Jorge as Drew pulled up the old last contact method at Trent's table, and they had no choice but to sort of let him sit with them. I say sort of because he didn't eat anything, and technically he didn't ever sit in a chair. For the entire lunch period, he was on his knees, crawling around their table in circles, pretending to look for his left contact lens. At first, I felt kind of bad for him. He looked so pitiful. But then Trent got out of his chair and started looking, too. I sighed. I turned back to my tray and made eye contact with one of Heidi Hemingway's girlfriends, who looked at me, then the empty chairs around me, and even though it made no sense, I suddenly picked up my banana and pretended talking to it as if it was my cell phone, laughing into the peel at something imaginary my friend had said. So, trying to get popular people to like you by having them help you find your lost contacts lens was the second stupidest method in the world. Chapter 22. It turned out I was celebrating my victory over Drew a little too early because on Monday morning I overheard everyone talking about another party at Angie's on Saturday that I hadn't been invited to. Trent had gone, of course, so had Donnie. Even the Sweet Brothers had gone, which meant I wasn't becoming popular through the detention theory like I had thought. Heck, I was no different from poor old Pierre something and his fancy box of French cookies. And like Pierre something, I had run out of cookies. It simply wasn't enough just to get them all in detention. I needed to step it up with Sally in order for Angie to consider inviting me to her next party. Then everyone would mistakenly assume I was popular like them and all would be right in the world. I made a mental note as I walked into detention that I was going to draw Sally the most amazing unicorn ever. She'd be so impressed and grateful for my art skills that, heck, she'd invite me to the next party herself. I tried to picture what the most amazing unicorn ever would look like. My first ideas were kind of pitiful. A 2-horned unicorn? Nope. A 3-horned unicorn? I pictured it, and it looked like a really skinny triceratops. I reminded myself to think outside the box, and that's when the solution came to me. The answer wasn't adding details to a regular unicorn, but to use multiplication. I simply draw her a picture of a tiny teenage unicorn riding atop another unicorn. That's right, double unicorn. I guess there is a time and place for math in the real world, after all, I thought. I showed up at room 12 that afternoon and immediately saw that my fears were true. Hank was talking to Trent, and even worse, Donnie was already drawing a unicorn for Sally. It suddenly occurred to me that maybe drawing unicorns wasn't the key to getting invited to parties on the weekends. I sat down at the desk and nobody even looked at me because I was no longer their savior. I was just another kid in detention. That's all. A minute later, Hugh walked in and he looked really mad. I felt nervous for some reason. "What's going on?" Trent asked him. "This thief stole my baseball cap," he replied. "I thought you lost your hat a long time ago," I asked him. "That was Hank's hat." "How could you confuse us?" "Well, you are twins," I started saying, but he glared at me. "We have to catch the thief," Hank said, pounding a fist against a desk. Mr. Tinsley looked up at him. "Sorry, Teach." "It's impossible. There are 300 students in the school. How could we possibly figure out who the thief is?" Hugh groaned, but my heart skipped a beat. Maybe this was an opening, a way I could get everyone to really like me. My unicorn drawing plan was a bust, and Trent and Donnie were just as chummy with the Sweet Brothers as I was. So without thinking, I said, "It'd be pretty easy to deduce who did it, actually." "I'm listening," Hugh said, staring at me. Mr. Tinsley got up from his seat. "I have a student conference, but I'll be right next door. If I hear anything, you all get another detention. Everyone stay in your seats, and I'll be back before the end of the period." With the teacher gone, I went up to the front of the class and got their attention by scraping my nails down the chalkboard. They winced. "That wasn't really necessary," Hank said. "We're already paying attention to you. Anyway, look. The first thing we have to do is narrow down the list of possible suspects." "But the thief could be anyone," Hugh said. "Are you the thief?" I asked him. "Why would I steal my own hat?" "How about you, Sally? Are you the thief?" "I didn't steal my own keychain." "So that's 2 of the 300 we just ruled out," I said. They all murmured approvingly, recognizing my genius deducting skills. "See, you're looking at it the wrong way. To narrow down the list of possible suspects, we need to make lists." I took out my notebook and opened to the first blank page, which sadly, given the fact that it was over a month into the school year, was page 3, and started ripping out pages and passing them around. Once everyone had a page, I said, "Okay, for a couple of minutes, work on a list of possible enemies. Then we'll go over the list and see if any of the names turn up more than once, and then those would be our main suspects." "That's a good idea," Donnie admitted. I started feverishly writing down names of people who'd picked on me or laughed at me or ignored me at the start of school, just practically everyone. I looked up and noticed nobody else was writing. Instead, they were all staring at each other with confused looks on their faces. "Why aren't you writing any names down?" I asked. "I don't have any enemies," Sally said, and I felt my ears redden. "Sally's the most popular girl in the entire school, practically," Hank said. "Her birthday party at Angie's house this weekend was the biggest party ever." "Same goes for Trent," Donnie added. "The basketball guys rule the school." "And everyone respects you, Donnie," Trent said. "You're like the Hemingway version of the human calculator." Frankly, I was disgusted that they were saying this. Were they really this full of themselves? I looked over at the Sweet Brothers and was appalled to see that they were drawing mazes instead of making a list. "Really? You two don't have any enemies?" I asked. "You guys bully everyone in school." Exactly, but we're equal opportunity bullies. We bully everyone, so you'd have to list everyone, which would be a complete waste of time. Well, you do have a point there, I admitted. I turned to Sally. Did everyone in school go to your party, Sally? I blushed, realizing I was pointing out that the thief would probably be someone who didn't go to the party, and I had momentarily forgotten that I was one of those people. Of course not. Angie's basement can't hold that many people. You know that. How would I know that? I wondered. Street Magic's assistant has a point. Wouldn't people who didn't get invited to your party have a reason to resent you? Donnie asked, and then I started feeling nervous again. They probably didn't even know about it, Sally replied. Yeah, they're probably doing other stuff and could care less about going anyway. This is too hard, Sally said. I can't handle thinking about such big numbers. I can't remember everyone who didn't go to my party. You're good about thinking about this stuff, Peter. Just try to remember who didn't go. I blushed. What the heck was she talking about? Didn't she know I didn't go to it or any party Angie and Sally ever had? Or was this a trap? I tried to keep a straight face. You want me to remember who wasn't at your last party? I asked. Yeah. I was busy hosting the thing. You know better than I would. It was weird. I felt lucky and relieved that they mistakenly thought I went to these parties, but at the same time it almost made me feel more mad that they didn't realize I hadn't gone. Well, you can't accuse us, Peter, because we hung out at the party. Remember, Hugh said? Didn't we? I panicked that he was going to realize I wasn't there. I had to mention a detail about the party to prove I was there, but I had no idea what a middle school party looked like, having never been to one. All I had to go on was me and Drew's fake party. I pictured Drew in a dress, sitting up in Corbett Canyon, and I sighed. I took a stab in the dark. Oh yeah, we were drinking that weird drink together. He didn't say anything at first, and I was positive he was going to point out that the rule at Angie's house was that they only served solids, no liquids. I'd be busted. Right, Hugh said a moment later. I exhaled softly. That drink was gross. It's safe to admit now, right, Sally? Trent said. Oh, be quiet, Sally said, smiling. I was too hyper for that weird drink, so I probably didn't notice everyone. Instead, let's try another method, I said, ripping out a new page and crumpling up the previous lists. No more lists, Sally whined. It feels like work. And she got her wish because a moment later the bell rang. To be continued, I said, but everyone was rushing out the door already. I suddenly got an idea, so instead of heading home, I jogged through the school to the top of the back stairway where I saw Sunny lugging her yellow duffel bag out of the library. What happened? Did you fall asleep? I asked her. School's been over for an hour. I was doing extra work on my invention, jailbird. She said, How's detention? I'm surprised you survived this long. Actually, I get along great with the Sweet Brothers, I said proudly. That's a good thing, because you'll already have friends if you ever end up going to prison. I was thinking the exact same, I started saying before realizing she was being sarcastic. I headed into the library and found Miss Shoemaker pulling all the chairs into the table. She looked up at me. I just had an idea. If I could catch the thief at Fenwick Middle, could I get out of detention on Wednesdays and come back to tag sooner? She sighed. That's not how it works, unfortunately. Have you ever heard of the word ownership? That's what you're doing by going to detention. You're taking responsibility for your actions. Have you ever heard of the word parole? I replied, or the phrase time off for good behavior? You're not in prison, she said. I'm sorry, Peter, so there's nothing I can do about your detention situation. I started heading back out. Peter, she said, and I stopped, you can still participate in the Inventors Fair if you can work on a prototype in your spare time. That's the best I can do. On the way home, I couldn't help myself and stopped by Drew's house. I figured even though we'd agreed to separate, maybe he'd beg me to take him back. Maybe he'd be up for joining the club in detention, and things would be perfect. He was sitting in the middle of the backyard counting clovers. How many did you collect? I asked. Not many, but there are tons of clovers all around you. It would take forever. I'm not exactly in a rush, he said, not looking at me. I waited 10 seconds for him to break down into tears and beg me to take him back, but he just kept staring at the grass. Speaking of collecting, I kind of feel like counting the mica, he said. He looked at me with a puzzled expression on his face. Why? You hate the mica. I don't know. I just feel like it, I said, and started climbing up the ladder to Corbett Canyon. At the top of the ladder, I looked down at Drew. He was staring at his clovers. This made me a little mad. I was only pretending to be interested in mica to make him happy, and he didn't even care. I went inside and opened up the safe and gasped. The bag was gone. Where's the mica? I shouted. He raced up the ladder. It should be right there, he said. I sat down in the middle of the treehouse. The thief stole our mica collection, I said. That's impossible. There's a lock on the safe, Drew replied. I can't believe this happened, I said, and kicked at the wall. You don't care, Drew said. You're the one who wanted to chuck the mica. I do care. Now I'm going to have to really catch the thief. If you join my detention club, you could help us solve the mystery of the thief. Oh, so you're in a club now, he said, and climbed back down the ladder without looking for me. And to think I even felt sorry for you, I called out after him, but he was gone. A minute later, he climbed back up into the treehouse and sat next to me. I thought you were going somewhere, I said. Well, I live here, he said. Oh, right. We didn't say anything, and it started feeling really awkward sitting in the tiny treehouse together and not talking like that, so I eventually left. All right, 6th graders, that was Detention Club, chapters 20 to 22. Thank you for watching and listening.